Welcome to Resilience and Resolve with Lance Drury.
Hello and welcome. I'm Evan Mack with tax attorney Lance Drury. Today's episode dives into the complicated intersection of IRS debts and divorce, who's responsible, how liability is divided, and what protections exist when a marriage ends, but the IRS still wants its money. This is Tax and Debt Divorce. What you don't know can hurt. Lance Drury, sir, how are you today?
Evan, I'm doing great. How are you today?
I'm good. I'm feeling the green jacket. I like this. The green blazer. You don't see a green blazer too often now.
Well, I have quite a few of them, but I have quite a few sports coats. So,
so let's get it. Let's get into the nitty gritty. How does IRS debt typically get addressed in a divorce settlement?
well, the IRS is a creditor, just like all kinds of other creditors that are dealt with through the divorce. But here's the thing: you can't bind any creditor, the IRS or anybody else, your mortgage company, whoever, to what happens in divorce court because they're not a party to that lawsuit. And so, you go in and let's say the husband agrees to assume 100% of the tax liability. Well, that doesn't prevent the IRS from going after the woman, his spouse, for the IRS monies because they're not bound by that agreement. What happens then is that in divorce court, there's typically what's called, and at least in Missouri, I don't know about other states, what's called a hold harmless and indemnify clause. So if the woman ends up paying $10,000 to the IRS of the tax debt that the husband agreed to assume in its totality, she then has to go back to divorce court if he doesn't voluntarily give her the money to get a judgment to get that monies back from the husband. But that's all handled in the divorce court. The IRS is free to go after whoever they want. And typically it's the same thing with a mortgage company. If both people are on the mortgage, but one keeps the home and they assume the rest of the mortgage, the mortgage company can still go after both of them. So that's how that works. In divorce court, it doesn't bind the IRS at all.
So can you touch on that a little bit more? Can both spouses still be liable even after the divorce is finalized?
Yes. With the IRS, both spouses are still liable. The IRS can go after one 100%, can go after the other one 100%, or just go after both of them. But that's up to the IRS. They're still free to do that because they're not bound by the divorce in any way, shape, or form.
Have you seen the IRS go after one and not the other?
Yes. And in fact, we just wrapped up a case. This couple was divorced several years ago. So the husband said, well, I don't need your services anymore because she's agreed to pay all the IRS debt because it was from her business. So, he wasn't listening to what I wanted to say about, well, they could still come after you. Well, just not too long ago, we're running out the clock on her debt. All this six-figure liability is going to go away, like in less than a year. Well, he's filing a contempt motion because she's not taking care of an agreement with the IRS. And I don't know how my lawyer in Nashville did it, but Jeff took care of it in the Nashville office. He got her on like $140 a month payment. The clock's going to run out soon. And again, I don't know, because she makes good money. There had to be something else going on there that I'm not aware of, but he got her a great deal. So she's going to pay very little of that debt back to the IRS. And now that she's got an agreement, they're not going to go after him because there's an agreement in place to pay back the money.
Amazing. So what is innocent spouse relief?
Well, I just talked about innocent spouse relief not too long ago, and that's where you have to file jointly. But the most common is we have had women in the past who were shielded from their husband's businesses, from their financial transactions. They did sign the return, but we got a woman off of six figures. Her husband owned a restaurant and a bowling alley, but she had all of this documented through the divorce proceedings. So we were able to submit all this documentation from the divorce to show the IRS that she should be granted innocent spouse relief, which she did. She was granted such relief because she was shielded from all his business transactions, didn't know what was going on with the financial affairs because he took care of all that. So that's the most common type of innocent spouse release that you can get. It's not something that happens all the time, but it is one of those options in a number of cases.
Speaking of the innocent spouse relief, when is it a viable option in your opinion? Like when would you recommend that to a client?
Well, you have to file a joint return. If you file a separate return, there's no innocent spouse relief available.
Okay.
But you generally recommend it where one of the spouses was shielded from all of the business transactions, from all the personal financial transactions, because the other party took care of those things, and they were basically left in the dark for years and years what was actually transpiring with their tax situation. So that's when you're going to do it. Just because you're married and say you're a W-2 wage earner, so the taxes are automatically taken out, and the spouse is self-employed and doesn't make estimated tax payments, and all the liability then is a result of the self-employed individual, that's not grounds for innocent spouse relief. And a lot of people then also, they want to go from married filing jointly to separate. Well, the IRS doesn't allow that because that would get them out of the tax liability. So that's not an option, but people come to you and want to do that, but that's just not legally available.
How does the IRS determine the responsibility in jointly filed returns?
Well, both parties are liable. Both parties are responsible. So, there's no divvying up the responsibility. They're not going to do this analysis and say, oh, it all came from the husband's business. We're only going to go after the husband. That you filed married filing jointly. So it's your debt just as well as your spouse's. And so that debt is not going to get divvied up. Both parties are on the line for that particular debt, unless you can prove innocent spouse or something else.
So what role does timing, let's say like a debt is accrued, what role does timing play in these different types of cases?
Well, the timing is critical if, the IRS does not have forever to collect the tax. It's normally 10 years from the date the tax is assessed, but there are so many things that can stop the running of the statute on collections, so that for each tax liability year or quarter, if it's payroll taxes, we have to compute what's the last day that the IRS has to collect the tax. And a lot of times the IRS does not have the proper date. And then we get into arguments with the IRS about when the clock actually stops running. So if you're close, say within 2 years of the clock running out and you've got a substantial piece of debt, we're not going to get an agreement with the IRS. We're just going to attempt to run out the clock, because we got a guy in Tennessee. He owed $500,000. We get involved in the case, find out he makes $500,000 a year. And I thought, oh my God, he's going to pay every last dime back. And he paid me a good chunk of money because he owed a good chunk of money. Well, last September, we ran out about $150,000 of that debt. And now in less than 2 years, the balance will run out. So we're just running out the clock, because even if they go after him a few months from now, they're never going to collect $350,000 in a year or a little more. So we're just going to run out the clock on collection. He probably will not pay the vast majority of that debt.
Man, Lance, you're pretty good at what you do, huh?
I try, but it takes a lot of hard work. And I've got to tell you, I don't do a lot of cases anymore, Evan, because, and I think we've talked about this, I'm still growing the business. I just got back from my San Antonio off, and they've scheduled me all day today, which is Thursday, and tomorrow I'm fully booked, doing initial consults, going through cases with the attorneys. But I have the best set of practitioners I've ever had. Wow. I have eight other attorneys, one here in St. Genevieve. He's from Paris, France originally. I have 2 attorneys in Los Angeles who immigrated from Iran. I have Jordan, who's in Orlando, Florida, worked with a friend of mine, managed over 300 cases at a time. And I have Abigail and Elizabeth in Nashville, and Jeff and Matthew, and they have a lot of experience. They're sharp. I've got better practitioners than I ever had. And when I started this, I said, I'm just going to hire enrolled agents. I'm not going to hire attorneys. Enrolled agents, you got to take a test to be federally licensed before the IRS. Well, I'm going to tell you right now, I've hired some ex-IRS employees. I'm sure there's several that are great. but I will never hire an ex-IRS employee again. I will never hire an enrolled agent. They want just as much money as the attorneys, and they do not have the argumentation skills or negotiation skills that attorneys have because we're trained in that. That's what we did for, And the other thing is they don't seem to be as concerned about the client as attorneys are. We're taught that our primary obligation is to zealously represent our clients. I was a public defender for 10 years.
Wow.
Murder cases, child abuse cases, but your bottom line is it doesn't matter. Your obligation is to your client. You're ethically bound to represent your client to the best of your ability. And that carries through more with attorneys than it does with non-attorneys.
We talked about it in different episodes, but how much do you see a difference in, we talked about the lack of, how IRS says they are having trouble with, employing people or having time, like getting to so many things. So do you see them pursuing more when it comes to this, like the divorce stuff? Do you see them taking more attention to this, or do you still find that same issue that we talked about previously about, not having enough staff to kind of pursue cases like this?
Right. But they don't have enough staff, and nobody wants the IRS to be fully staffed because then they'll become aftering people left and right. And, for every dollar they spend on enforcement, they bring in $5. So every time they cut the budget, they're losing $5 for every dollar they cut spending by. But then when somebody has a problem with the IRS and it takes a year or longer for things to get resolved, then people are upset. And so that's the problem, is that you're not going to get serviced, and they don't understand. And sometimes we get the taxpayer advocate involved, but their staff has just been cut. They're not taking every case that comes up to them. And so it's just something that we have to live with. It's the new reality. Cases are going to take longer. If you amend a tax return, it's going to take a year to 2 years for that return to process. So, or if you file a tax return, an older tax return, it's going to take much longer, because only like the last couple of years can you file electronically. And those get processed quicker, but the paper ones, those take a long time. It can take 8 months or longer for those returns to process. So, I understand it's very frustrating to taxpayers. It's frustrating to us because we're having to spend more time since the pandemic on cases than we did before, because there's a lot of people up there that don't know what they're talking about because they're not trained properly, particularly in the automated collection system. And so, we have to hang up with them and then call back and get somebody that knows what they're talking about. So it's frustrating to taxpayers. It's frustrating to us, but it's the new reality. And historically, you don't see the IRS coming back to where they were prior to a government shutdown. They never catch back up. I'll just give you a small example. In the old days, when I started doing this 20 years ago, take a week to 10 days for a power of attorney to process. Wow. It's now taking a minimum of 20 business days, a minimum. So you're talking a month at least before your power of attorney can be processed, before you can get information concerning your client's case. You could call them up, but we don't like to do that because that just puts you on their radar. And that's when they start making threats of levy and this and that. So we don't like calling them up unless there's already a deadline in place or we're ready to get our client's case resolved.
So when that special moment occurs, when a divorce is like amicable, you know what I mean, and no one's trying to, when that time happens, and can divorce agreements like that override the IRS enforcement that we've been talking about?
No, never.
Wow.
Because the IRS is not a party to the divorce. And so, like I said earlier, if one of the spouses agrees to assume 100% of the tax liability debt from the IRS, and the other person gets levied and loses $5,000, $10,000, $15,000, their only recourse is to go back to divorce court because the spouse would have had a clause that said, I will agree to indemnify and hold harmless my spouse on any of the debts that I agreed to assume. Or they can just voluntarily pay him back and avoid all the expense of lawyers again and all of that, because it's going to end up costing them more money if they got to go back to court.
So what's the best advice you could give someone facing a divorce with unresolved tax liabilities?
Well, that's a good question, because, there's nothing really I can do to isolate them from that tax debt. So, whatever happens in that divorce proceeding, they're still going to need legal assistance to deal with the IRS if they want to be free from any levies, because they can wipe out your bank account. They can take 90% of your take-home pay. They can take 100% of your 1099s. So they still are going to have to get legal assistance. Don't be blind into thinking that just because you have that agreement, the ball game's over and you're free from the clutches of King Kong, aka the IRS.
Thank you so much for your time, Mr. Lance.
Thank you, Evan. Thank you very much. Always a pleasure. I love talking to you.
Love talking to you too. Now remember, divorce doesn't erase IRS debts. Visit lancedrurylaw.com to protect your financial future during and after a separation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.